Welcome to the Diefenbunker's Cold War Speaker Series. This is our third and final event in this year's series, where we hear lectures and talks given by guests on Cold War themes, both within Canada and around the world. My name is Sean Campbell, and I am the curator here at the museum. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Kevin Spooner. Dr. Spooner is Professor of North American Studies and History at Wilfrid Laurier University, where he is also the director of the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. Kevin received his MA and PhD in Canadian history from Carleton University, after also studying at Trent and Queen's University. Contributing to the development of North American studies at Laurier, Kevin served as program coordinator from 2009 to 2014 and currently teaches core courses for North American studies and upper year courses in aspects of the history of Canadian foreign policy, particularly Canada's contribution to international peacekeeping and Canadian relations with Africa. Canada's place in the world from the 1940s to the 1960s remains an important focus of his writing. His current manuscript project explores the impact of decolonization on Canadian relations with Africa during the governments of John Diefenbunker and Lester Pearson. In this talk, Dr. Spooner will discuss Canada's role, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, exploring the connections between race and the battle for allegiances between East and West during the Cold War, and Canada's peacekeeping legacy that rests within it. Many geopolitical actors today, notably China and Russia, continue to attempt to influence regions, including Africa and Asia. I feel like tonight's talk will be of interest to understand a bit more of Canada's history in relation to formerly colonized areas of the world. I would now like to welcome Dr. Kevin Spooner to the virtual podium. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'd like to give special thanks to Sean for inviting me to participate in the Diefenbunker's Cold War Speaker Series. I first met Sean a few years ago when Professor Sarah Matthews, a dear colleague and fellow at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada, organized a conference with the Diefenbunker. We spent a couple of days actually meeting in the bunker, which was very cool. And it was such a great experience because of the tremendous hospitality provided by Sean and really everyone at the bunker. So it's nice to have a chance to reconnect this evening with you folks. Before we start, I also want to acknowledge the two speakers who came before me this fall. Isabel Campbell is just such a terrific historian and colleague. We worked together for several years on the C.P. Stacey Prize for Canadian Military History. And I was fortunate to have Matt Wiseman as one of my brilliant PhD students in the Tri-University History Graduate Program at Laurier. And mentoring Matt was a highlight in my career for sure. And they're both hard acts to follow, and I do kind of wish that I had asked Sean to schedule me first after the two of them went. But I'll try to do my best to do honor to them as well. So tonight's talk is entitled Canada, Africa, and Peacekeeping in the Cold War. I've added the word peacekeeping to the title as it was originally advertised to try and narrow things down a little bit, and also to build on some work that I'm doing at the moment for an edited collection being done by Asa McKercher and Tim Sale on really important and overdue re-examination of Canada's place in the Cold War. So this is partly also based on some work that I've been doing for them. So I hope that my screen is sharing okay and everything is good on that front. So my outline for tonight, just to give you some sense of where I'm going here, I'm going to provide a little bit of context, both historical and historiographical, mostly historical, on where we and how we end up peacekeeping in Africa, focusing my primary case study really on ONUC, the thing that I know most about, having written about this several years ago in a monograph. So I will use Canada and ONUC as a kind of center point case study. But really, I want to contextualize it a little bit with what comes before ONUC and then also what comes afterwards to try to understand Canada's place in both peacekeeping, but also in the Cold War. So that's kind of my roadmap for where we're headed tonight. So usually when we talk about the Cold War, we understand it in simple ideological terms, right? This was a decades-long conflict fought on the one side by the Democratic West and on the other side by the Communist East. And in that fight, there's never any doubt as to where Canada stood. We're always in the Western camp, even if we occasionally appeared a somewhat less strident camper. At times, Canada did prove more willing, I think, to demonstrate a greater degree of objectivity and restraint in our foreign policy, at least when we make a comparison with our neighbor, the sort of paramount Western power, the United States. But in some senses, that's too simplistic an interpretation. And I'd like to suggest that North-South was an equally important axis for Canada, intersecting and in some ways complicating the ideological directions on that Cold War compass. As the West colonial empires disintegrated, especially from the 1940s to the 1970s, decolonization hugely increases the number of nations on the world stage. And that creates opportunities for both sides in the Cold War to exploit the tensions and the complexities accompanying that development. While the threat of nuclear Armageddon made open conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States almost unthinkable, proxy conflicts in Africa, Asia, and Central America, the very settings of decolonization, enabled each side in the Cold War to engage openly and subversively in support of their favored surrogates. Colonial legacies certainly left key Western powers vulnerable to critique by the Communist bloc and its global South movements. But the West could also be divided on this issue, especially in the decade following the Second World War. The North American allies did not always entirely see eye to eye with the European powers, who stood to lose the most, of course, when their empires vanished. Canada certainly tried to distinguish itself at the time and within the West as a non-colonial power, a nation set apart by the fact that it had no overseas empire. And of course, now historians complicate that picture, pointing to examples in Canada's early foreign economic relations that clearly show our exploitive global ambitions. And then, of course, there's also Canada's record of colonialism at home with respect to Indigenous peoples. And this definitely undermines any attempt to suggest Canada was free, completely free of the taint of colonialism. Still, the Canadian foreign policy elite, for much of the Cold War, were highly successful in portraying and positioning Canada as a middle power. Primarily, they framed this concept with respect to capabilities. Acknowledging Canada wasn't a great power, they argued its capacity to contribute to the international community justified a rank above the lesser or smaller countries. Beyond capabilities, being in the middle might also suggest a degree of ideological flexibility. If Canada was not the coldest of Cold War warriors, then maybe it could stake out some more moderate ground on the East-West axis. Being in the middle, I think, also raised the prospect of Canada serving as a bridge between the colonial powers who dominated the Western Alliance and the decolonizing world. For sure, this notion of a bridge was a cliche, if ever there was one, but it was still deployed with some effect. And I think that was driven home to me just recently, the last couple of weeks here at the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. We hosted a colleague from Ghana who had the chance to go to the Mohawk Institute, one of the residential schools, of course, at Six Nations. And she came back from that experience really profoundly impacted. And one of the things she said to me was, I don't know who you have in Canada doing your PR work, but it's incredible, right? On the world stage, you have this incredible image. And she was feeding back to me this notion that the foreign policy elite back in the Cold War were trying to convey that we were this non-colonial nation. And she said, clearly you were a colonial nation. You're looking at what happened here at home. But it says something about the power and the potency, I think, of that image early in the Cold War. In many ways, United Nations peacekeeping emerges as an imperfect solution to one of the Cold War's many intractable problems. Stymied by the diplomatic deadlock of the Security Council's permanent members, the UN generally proved incapable of dealing with international conflicts, at least in the way originally intended by those who drafted the charter. Consequently, aside from the Korean War, member states loaned troops to the UN not to fight wars or impose peace, but to de-escalate conflicts through ceasefire observation and the interposition of forces between combatants. Cold War Political considerations ruled out the Security Council's permanent members from serving on peacekeeping's front lines. So UN Secretaries General were compelled to look to other nations with the military capacity to contribute peacekeepers. But that would also be seen as politically acceptable, or at least tolerable. Enter, stage door left or right, Canada. Throughout the Cold War, this country came to be the international peacekeeper par excellence. Walter Dorn, one of Canada's leading peacekeeping experts, reminds us that Canada provided more peacekeepers to the UN than any other nation during the Cold War, sending about 80,000 soldiers to UN operations. That accounts for about 10% of the UN total by the late 1980s. To this day, with a death of 124 personnel, Canada still ranks seventh in the world in terms of peacekeeping fatalities. And the vast majority of these casualties occurred on UN missions during the Cold War. The two earliest UN missions shaped how later peacekeeping evolved, and in both cases, UN personnel were dispatched to address conflicts associated with the challenges of decolonization, a key theme tonight. The United Kingdom held a mandate over Palestine until 1948, when it relinquished control. The UN General Assembly had endorsed a plan calling for the division of Palestine into two states, Arab and Jewish, but hostilities broke out immediately after the British ended their mandate, and the two-state plan, as we all well know, was never realized. The Security Council quickly called for a cessation of hostilities, and it established the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, or UNSO. Pictured here is Major General E.L.M. Burns, who would become the Chief of Staff to UNSO, here on the left. This is a group of military observers sent to ease tensions in the region. Headquartered in Jerusalem, UNSO actually remains stationed in the Middle East to this day. Down through the decades, Canadians have consistently served in this mission, most notably Tommy Burns, as I've just pointed out, as Chief of Staff from 1954 to 1956. And as late as this summer, there are still 5 Canadians still serving. We're still 5 Canadians serving with UNSO. On the Indian subcontinent, British decolonization again set the stage for the dispatch of another UN peace observation mission. The partition of the British Indian Empire into the two nations of India and Pakistan in 1947 resulted in horrific violence as Muslim and Hindu citizens of the new states resettled in a mass migration across the newly created borders. The state of Jammu and Kashmir, however, was especially problematic. Intent initially on remaining independent, Kashmir's rulers soon aligned with India to thwart incursions from Pakistan. This led to direct hostilities between the two countries until the UN arranged a ceasefire along a line dividing Kashmir into Indian and Pakistani administered regions. Military observers sent by the UN to oversee the ceasefire first arrived in January 1949 and a year later were established as the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, or UNMOGIP. Initially, about a quarter of the 34 observers were Canadian, and the Canadian Armed Forces went on to provide air transport for this UN mission through to the 1990s, with more than 350 Canadians ultimately serving with UNMOGIP. Now, some important lessons can be gleaned from these earliest UN missions. First, decolonization and the north-south direction of international relations were in some ways more significant than the Cold War's ideological East-West division in shaping Canada's early engagement with UN peacekeeping. Still, Cold War political considerations were not entirely absent. Ottawa demonstrated real concern whenever it seemed its key allies, the US and the UK, could diverge on international issues in ways that suggested divisions in their emergent post-Second World War alliance against communism. The beginning of the end of European colonial empires, as the United States became the preeminent Western superpower, created opportunities for just such tensions. In these moments, the UN proved to be a helpful stage to play out Canadian diplomacy. Second point, the unwillingness of the Security Council's permanent members to take the assertive actions allowed for under the UN Charter to address breaches of the peace created opportunity for more passive approaches to intervention, including observer missions such as UNSO and UNMOGIP. Canada proved a willing and, I would suggest, capable contributor of armed forces personnel, who then gained important expertise from being present at the creation of what would later become peacekeeping. With the 1956 Suez Crisis, the potential divisions over colonial empires within the Western Alliance were laid bare. Just as Canadian officials feared, upset over the refusal by the United States to finance the Aswan Dam project, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser seized control of the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel then secretly conspired together to invade Egypt, taking control of the canal zone. Caught unaware by the actions of their European allies, both Canada and the United States were incensed. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent angrily called out Britain and France in the House of Commons, saying, "The members of the smaller nations are human beings, just as are their people. The era when the supermen of Europe could govern the whole world has and is coming pretty close to an end." Secretary of State for External Affairs, Lester Pearson, chimed in that Canada would not be Britain's colonial chore boy. For years, Nasser had been cleverly playing each side in the Cold War off one another, trying to secure financing and armaments for Egypt. While the Americans had grown impatient with these games, they also recognized that Britain and France had essentially just given the Soviets a Cold War own goal. At the UN, Ottawa and Washington worked to find a face-saving solution to this international crisis that threatened Western solidarity. The key to resolving the crisis was finding some means by which the French and British could withdraw their armed forces from the Canal Zone, while also separating Egyptian and Israeli forces. UNSO, already in the Middle East, provided a ready example of how UN forces could be used to ease tensions, providing reassurance through the presence of international observers. The Suez Crisis, however, required intervention on a scale much larger than the relatively small number of military observers the UN had dispatched with UNSO and UNMOGIP. Lester Pearson proved to be the right person in the right place at the right time to offer up a solution. A diplomat who held the respect of his British and American colleagues in particular, Pearson shuttled between Ottawa and New York, developing plans for a larger scale military force to be composed of personnel loaned to the UN and deployed into Egypt, providing stability while the French, British, and Israeli forces withdrew. The United Nations Emergency Force, or UNEP as it comes to be known, was established by the UN General Assembly in November 1956, reaching a maximum strength of more than 6,000 peacekeepers within 6 months. UNEF not only helped resolve an international crisis threatening to destabilize the Cold War, it also provided a way to heal a growing rift within the West, emerging as European empires were taking their final gasps. For his troubles, Pearson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and Canadian Lieutenant General E.L.M. Burns, Tommy Burns, served as UNEF's first force commander, and 10,000 Canadians ultimately served with UNEF by the time it hastily departed in 1967. You can see here a couple of pictures I found on Library and Archives Canada's website of peacekeepers on patrol in the Sinai. The lower picture, of course, Pearson on the left. And up top, we have Major General Tommy Burns on the flight deck, actually, of the Magnificent, Canada's aircraft carrier that was dispatched to help with the deployment of Canadian equipment with UNEF. Because Cold War politics made it nearly impossible for the Security Council to take concerted enforcement action under UN Charter Chapter 7, that's the provision in the Charter that allows the Security Council to take action by force, sanctions or military force. It was the General Assembly that authorized UNEF. But the General Assembly does not have the international legal authority to impose its will by force. Consequently, UNEF set several important precedents that fundamentally shaped all Cold War peacekeeping operations. So let's take a quick look at those. First, there's the principle of consent. UNEF could only be deployed to Egypt because that country agreed to the presence of the peacekeepers in the first instance. So long as the host country remained agreeable, the UN could stay. Second, peacekeepers were expected to be impartial. It was not their place to influence the outcome of a conflict in favor of any one side. Third, peacekeepers were permitted to use force only in self-defense. If fired on first, they could return fire to protect themselves, but the use of offensive force was strictly prohibited. These three principles governed how peacekeeping operations were conducted throughout the Cold War decades and helped to explain why UNEF was compelled to leave Egypt in 1967. When the host nation abruptly withdrew consent, remaining in Egypt was, in effect, untenable, even if the withdrawal seemed an embarrassing failure for the UN at the time. These early peacekeeping principles were very much put to the test during the Congo crisis of the early 1960s, when the UN dispatched nearly 20,000 personnel at a nearly crippling financial cost to deal with the chaos that ensued in the early days after the Congo secured independence from Belgium. Once again, decolonization, we see, provides the underlying context for what was seen at the time as a Cold War proxy struggle in Africa between East and West. Give me a sec. I apologize for the fuzziness of this picture. I searched high and low for a public domain picture of Lieutenant General Emile Janson, a Belgian officer, and this was the best I could find. So that's what we're left with. Belgian officials in the Congo certainly didn't help matters. Even after independence, the country's military, the Force Publique, was still led by a Belgian, and Lieutenant General Emile Janssens, pictured here. Pictured badly, but pictured here. During a briefing with his officers, in as clear a statement of neocolonialism as ever there was, he infamously scrawled on a blackboard, "Before independence equals after independence." And not long after, the Force Publique mutinied, and that places the already precarious government of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and President Joseph Kasavubu in jeopardy. They struggled to maintain order and national unity as the Force Publique mutinies. Concerned that Belgium was using the political instability as a pretext to intervene militarily and reassert control, Lumumba and Kasavubu appealed to the UN for assistance, collectively, together. They both do. Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, pictured here at the bottom at the UN headquarters, was receptive to the request, and on the 14th of July 1960, the Security Council authorized ONUC, the Opération Nations Unies au Congo, known by its French acronym, a peacekeeping mission that was tasked with ensuring Belgian forces withdrew, tasked with assisting the Congolese authorities to restore law and order, and it was also to provide technical assistance to the government. By 1960, John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservative Party was in government, and the Cold War was heating up. In May, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane, capturing the pilot, an incident that overshadowed and then ruined any prospects of improved relations that might have resulted from a major international summit in Paris. When member states gathered for the UN General Assembly that fall, Diefenbaker would be in fine fighting form, delivering a fiery speech that heavily criticized the USSR, most notably for its colonialism in Eastern Europe. This was the Cold War context for events unfolding in the Congo and for Diefenbaker's government as it contemplated whether to provide Canadian military personnel for ONU. And in fact, that fall session of the UN General Assembly in 1960 is famous. It's, of course, the one where people might recall Khrushchev takes off his shoe and starts pounding the desk, and leaders from around the world came in 1960. It was everybody who was anybody was in New York in 1960. And Diefenbaker used the opportunity really to deliver an incredibly Cold War fiery speech. Initially, Diefenbaker was reported to have reacted very negatively to the prospect of a Canadian commitment. His special assistant, Basil Robinson, recalled Diefenbaker had, quote unquote, shot out of his chair and insisted Hammarskjöld be told there would be no forces from Canada. He was said to have been emphatic on the point. In reality, there was never any question that Canada would provide infantry for ONUC. There were lots of assumptions and cross communications between New York and Ottawa over a frantic few days that led to misunderstanding. But Diefenbaker's initial reaction and Hammarskjöld's early plans, I think, are really quite revealing. In public statements, the Secretary General had alluded to the need for French-speaking peacekeepers. The prospect of sending white, French-speaking Canadians to a former Belgian colony to serve in the front lines of a peacekeeping mission, partly tasked with restoring internal order, was justifiably worrisome to Diefenbaker. For Ottawa, the political and racial implications of decolonization were front and center. Meanwhile, in New York, Hammarskjöld already knew employing forces from either NATO nations or the East Bloc was a non-starter if he had any hope to insulate ONUC from Cold War rivalries. Both East-West and North-South dimensions were in play. In the end, once force requirements were fully understood, both in New York and Ottawa, it was clear Canada could most usefully contribute air support, communications, and personnel for ONUC headquarters. Certainly not infantry, which is what everybody was assuming we were talking about in those initial few days. Ultimately, the signals are become, well, I would say there are two really fundamentally important contributions. The signals contribution, Canadian peacekeepers are among the first in the Congo, and they're among the last to leave because they're providing the critical signals network across the entire country. And they're also the RCAF provided critical air support. I've given privilege, I suppose, to the Army today and shown. I'm not showing the RCAF contribution here, but these are signalers spread throughout the Congo, Canadians playing a role. They essentially, the Congo is a huge, enormous country, not a lot of infrastructure in 1960. And so there were a lot of provincial detachments that needed communications back into the capital. And really, the Canadians were essential in creating that communications network that the peacekeeping mission as a whole relied on. Right down to delivering mail, which may be what that person's doing in the Jeep up in the top. One of the peacekeepers I remember writing with when I was working on this book was a postal delivery person, and so part of his job was delivering the mail. And he had really incredible, unique experiences traveling around the capital. When the Belgian ambassador to Canada calls on the Department of External Affairs in July 1960, he meets with Deputy Undersecretary of State for External Affairs Marcel Cadieux. Cadieux is pictured, again, I was trying to find a picture of Cadieux that's public domain, and that's not an easy thing to find either. But Cadieux is actually pictured here, kind of third from the left. And I mentioned Basil Robinson earlier. Basil Robinson's actually on the far left in that picture over here. Cadieu's a diplomat with prior experience in French Indochina, and he was immediately circumspect with the Belgian ambassador. That ambassador was keen for the West to take a firm, public stand against potential Soviet meddling. Now, could you acknowledge the potential for communist mischief, but then quite patronizingly stress the need for Belgium to consider the psychological shock former colonial authorities experienced when transferring authority, particularly when assessing communist threats? It wasn't exactly the full-throated endorsement that the Belgian ambassador was hoping for. And a few months later in Paris, Secretary of State for External Affairs Howard Green was even more direct with the North Atlantic Council, suggesting to his Western colleagues that there were disadvantages in trying to present a unanimous Western view on every issue before the UN. The wisdom in Green's position was echoed and supported back home in the Toronto Daily Star, where it was said the peoples, quote unquote, the peoples lately freed from colonialism are still rampantly suspicious of it. We can hardly expect them to trust an alliance, some of whose members still practice repressive colonialism. Canadian military personnel serving as ONU peacekeepers, if only in more supportive behind-the-scenes roles, as had largely been the case with UNEF, Ottawa considered it important to maintain some distance from its NATO allies, particularly those still plainly associated with colonialism. UNEF, ONUC, and the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus, UNFICYP, are typically seen as the three of the most significant Cold War UN peacekeeping missions for Canada, though the governments of Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney remain committed to playing this role long after the precedent set by St. Laurent, Diefenbunker, and the Pearson governments. I don't have a lot of time now to get into Cyprus. We could have a whole sort of 5 minute sideline onto that, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about Cyprus in question and answers afterwards if we want to go there, if people are interested. Some 15 additional UN peacekeeping operations took place from the mid 1960s, when the mission to Cyprus started, to the end of the Cold War. Canadian Armed Forces personnel were deployed to every one of them across Central America, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Many of these operations were short-lived, focused missions struck to oversee specific peace settlements with relatively small numbers of military observers. Some, though, did require more substantive resources, such as the reconstitution of the United Nations Emergency Force, or UNEF-2, in the wake of the Yom Kippur War. Other peacekeeping missions from this period are still in the field, including UNIFIL in Lebanon, UNDOF in the Golan Heights, and MINURSO in Western Sahara. I've highlighted in bright white the four that actually continue on from the Cold War, started in the Cold War and have continued on past the Cold War. MINURSO is yet another compelling example of how peacekeeping, even as late as the 1970s, continued to be rooted in challenges arising from African decolonization. When Spain ends its administration of the territory in 1976, conflict arose when Morocco attempted to take the territory, a move that's then resisted by the Front Polisario, supported by Algeria. The increasing tempo with which missions were initiated in this period is also important to note. Two-thirds of all these operations that are on the screen at the moment began in 1988 and later, in the Cold War's waning years. While the General Assembly and Security Council had continued to employ classic peacekeeping, there was a quiet decade from about 1978 to 1988 when no new missions were dispatched. Several of the existing missions, as I pointed out, they did continue, but there were no new missions for almost an entire decade. Then, with eased ideological tensions in the Cold War, brought about primarily by Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet political reforms in the late 1980s, international relations between East and West improved dramatically. A reinvigorated United Nations appeared poised to operate for the greater global good and in the way the UN's charter had envisaged as the Cold War came to an end. Initially, Canada's preeminent position as the world's leading peacekeeper survived this pivotal moment. In March 1992, just a few months after the Soviet Union had dissolved and the Russian Federation had assumed the UN membership and Security Council seat, Canada remained the largest personnel contributor to the 10 peacekeeping missions operating at that time. Significantly, these missions still mostly followed the precedents and the principles that I talked about earlier that had been set by classic Cold War peacekeeping, those principles of consent, impartiality, and passivity. Then, over the following year, there's a tremendous surge in the number of UN peacekeepers, from just over 14,000 to more than 78,000 by July 1993 in the UN overall. And in Canada, you also see a sort of corresponding surge of peacekeepers as the number of soldiers deployed abroad increases quite dramatically in the early 1990s as well. Our commitment mostly keeps pace with this more than five-fold increase in peacekeeping activity, with the total number of Canadian personnel serving with the UN peaking in April 1993 at 3,336. This is an enormous commitment by the Canadian Armed Forces to peacekeeping. The massive increase in UN peacekeeping was made possible because the Security Council was now effectively functioning as originally intended. no longer deadlocked by the Cold War. Operations were dispatched to the Balkans, Cambodia, Somalia, and Mozambique. And these new missions were typically large, often involving thousands of personnel. They could function entirely within countries, as opposed to classic peacekeeping that usually separated two or more state combatants, Cyprus being a weird example of within, peacekeeping within a country. Most importantly, all were approved with the full authority of the Security Council, a development that allowed for greater use of force and the eventual emergence of more robust and muscular peacekeeping. By the mid 1990s, the dramatic increase in UN peacekeeping wavered, and at the end of that decade, the number of peacekeepers posted abroad diminished to levels close to where they originally were when the Cold War had ended. Institutionally, the UN struggled to cope with the rapid increase in the number and complexity of post-Cold War missions, leading to some spectacular failures. For sure, when peacekeeping went wrong, there were often many contributing factors, not exclusively attributable to the UN, but its institutional shortcomings were front and center. Perhaps most notably, of course, during the Rwandan genocide, for which Romeo Dallaire, Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, was again front and center as head of the peacekeeping mission in Rwanda at the time. The drawdown in UN peacekeeping afforded an opportunity for introspection, culminating in the 2000 report of the Panel on United Nations Peace Operations, also known as the Brahimi Report. It was commissioned at the time by then Secretary General Kofi Annan. Brahimi clearly identified the end of the Cold War as a turning point, after which, in his words, complex and risky mission mandates have been the rule rather than the exception. If the Brahimi Report was a concerted effort by the UN to learn from its prior mistakes to allow for a re-engagement with peacekeeping, it seemed to work. In the years since, the number of UN peacekeepers again rose beyond 100,000 at times, though the current number sits at just over 61,000 spread across 11 missions, all those still in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, except for one, the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo, or UNMIK. While UN peacekeeping rebounded, Canadian peacekeeping did not. The brief surge from the end of the Cold War to April 1993 marked the end of an era. Just as the UN was compelled to come to grips with the institutional and systemic failings associated with peacekeeping, Canada confronted its own peacekeeping shortcomings. Somali teenager Shadain Aron was horrifically murdered by Canadian peacekeepers from the Canadian Airborne Regiment, who were serving with the Unified Task Force, or UNITAF, a United States-led but UN-sanctioned military force dispatched to replace the United Nations operation in Somalia, or UNISOM. The violence shocked Canadians, and it led to the establishment of an official inquiry to investigate the Canadian Force's deployment to Somalia. The Commission's final report, titled Dishonored Legacy, left no doubt that Canada's long-standing peacekeeping reputation was in tatters. The inherent racism underlying the peacekeepers' actions raised significant questions about the cultural obliviousness and ultimately the appropriateness of mostly white military personnel attempting to restore order in African nations. In Somalia, Canada was in effect compelled to directly confront the very same colonial and racist North-South realities that its Western allies had faced through the period of decolonization that had coincided with the Cold War. As troubling as they are, though, the events in Somalia alone don't fully explain why Canadian peacekeeping with the UN practically came to an end in the post-Cold War era. By 1997, when the number of Canadian peacekeepers serving with the UN fell to a new low of 250, kind of this area of the chart down here, star number 3, Jean Chrétien's Liberal government was in a determined effort to cut spending and balance the federal budget. The military wasn't spared, and the cost of UN peacekeeping had to be weighed against more pressing defense priorities. At the same time, Canadian deployments, military deployments abroad were increasingly with NATO in the Balkans. And then, after 9/11, the Canadian forces were consumed by the war in Afghanistan, a mission fully embraced by Stephen Harper's Conservative government once it assumed office in 2006. There have been occasional suggestions Canada might once again meaningfully return to UN peacekeeping. In 2017, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pledged the provision of a 200-soldier quick reaction force for service with the UN. Nearly a decade later, this hasn't materialized. There was a 5-year Canadian contribution to UN peacekeeping in Mali that came to an end in 2023, but this generally involved a small number of personnel, apart from a period between 2018 and 19 for about a year when there was a surge in personnel providing air support in particular. Picture here the last 5 Canadian peacekeepers in that operation. United Nations peacekeeping, it seems, was Canada's Cold War calling, right? We were the undisputed leading contributor to UN efforts to keep the peace in that era because the Cold War had, in fact, created the necessary conditions for this to happen. With the Security Council unable to act as intended because of the ideological rivalry between its permanent members, more creative ways to restore peace had to be found. Peacekeeping provided an alternative, ad hoc way forward for stabilizing international crises, even if this approach also limited what peacekeepers could do. While still firmly in the Cold War's Western camp, Canada demonstrated just enough impartiality to earn a modicum of credibility and soon came to be relied upon routinely as a middle power with the required military capabilities the UN needed for its peacekeeping missions. With most Cold War peacekeeping taking place where the messy legacies of colonialism had planted the seeds for later conflicts, it also helped that Canada was often perceived to be less historically complicit in this regard. Of course, Canada was not entirely innocent, and race was a significant factor in both the Cold War and in Canadian foreign policy. The complexities of global North-South intersections with the ideological bearing of East-West are a worthy subject, I think, for more study by scholars of Canada's international history. If the Cold War established the conditions for Canada to take up and carry on the calling of UN peacekeeping from the 1940s through to the 1990s, perhaps it was also the unintended reason why Canada stopped peacekeeping. At the end of the Cold War, the Security Council was suddenly enabled and emboldened to dispatch more muscular peacekeeping operations, but the UN soon recognized it was ill prepared for this development. Around the same time, Canada had to confront the consequences of its own peacekeeping failures in Somalia. Once the UN had reckoned with some of the lessons learned from those early post-Cold War years, international peacekeeping ramped up again, but this time without Canada. The military, now stretched thin by budget cuts and other priorities and alliance obligations consuming nearly all the remaining resources, Canadian peacekeeping became a bygone era legacy of the Cold War. Leave it there.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Spooner, for your presentation. So in advance of of the presentation that you gave, I was reading your book from 2009 about ONUC and the Congo crisis, and my frame of reference going into it previously was King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, and hearing about the Force Publique again, and seeing about the you know, potentially people of European descent coming back in to try to do peacekeeping in a time when so much of that colonial legacy was very, very deep and difficult to work with. So, it was really interesting going through your book and seeing that, how it is that that was being handled, and the idea that, maybe Turkish and Pakistani soldiers should go in if African soldiers from UN nations could not go in. Um, And given the prevalence of Diefenbunker in our site's history, it's interesting to learn of his handling of the mission to Congo was more decisive than his other handling of defense. And you mentioned it in the book how, his legacy has always been about whenever it comes to these big foreign policy decisions or defense policy decisions, there's always flip-flopping that happens. But you marked that this occasion was actually where it was a little more decisive. So it's interesting. And then also, it's a very similar attitude that he did to when he was approaching President Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how he stood his ground about, we're not immediately going to go with you on the way that continental defense is being done and telling us what to do with our military, similar to how I saw that Diefenbaker was feeling with the UN saying, well, we need troops to go. And then Diefenbaker said, well, you can say that, but we're not automatically. So, yeah. And it was also interesting to hear you speak on the fact that this mission challenges the popular notion of Canadians committed to peacekeeping for altruistic reasons. You quote in the book Professor Tom Keating. He said, Canadian support for multilateralism has not been an altruistic commitment to international order, but a means to meeting vitally important national objectives. So, not a real desire to send peacekeepers to police in this conflict, but they had something to score for political points. I was also fascinated by the narrative of framing the possible use of French-speaking troops in the crisis. I believe it was Hammarskjöld that referenced them as French-speaking transatlantic troops. And that really aided Diefenbaker because Diefenbaker wanted his one Canada policy and he didn't want it to be broken down into hyphenated Canadians. So
Mhm.
I thought that was, you know, and then also the idea going back to kingisms that we were talking about earlier. So not necessarily this idea of this conflict itself. Initially, Diefenbaker approaching it as being, and you referenced to it as not necessarily peacekeeping, but peacekeeping if necessary.
Mhm.
Um, and lastly, how public sentiment also helped to draw them to action. The fact that a July 1960 poll from the public about where they thought the most critical trouble spots in the world were between Russia, China, Cuba, and Congo, and how Congo ranked just behind Russia at the top spot. That's an important context at the start of a tumultuous decade, as you described with the U-2 plane being shot down. And then leading into next year with the Berlin crisis and, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a very rocky decade, but, I think it's people tend to gloss over all that happening. It's always Cuban Missile Crisis that's the big one. Um, and then as I was going through your book and I was thinking about it, I was thinking of the many conversations I've had with one of our guides, Gilles Coutremanche, and he was one of the signalmen sent to Congo from 1962 to 63 in the latter half. If you are in at the museum for a tour on a Thursday or Friday, he has some great stories to tell you. The
Sure.
one I always remember is him receiving a teletype in the middle of the night from Kinshasa that President Kennedy had been assassinated. So he was over in the Congo when that happened. And you also mentioned UNMOGEP. One of our museum's founders, Colonel Dave Peters, was a participant in UNMOGEP in the 1970s. So thank you, Dr. Spooner, for this talk and outlining this history for us. A reminder for the audience, don't be shy. You can enter your questions to the participant named Diefenbunker or to me at Curator in the chat to ask Dr. Spooner a question. I have a few thoughts I just wanted to bring up before we introduce questions from the audience. So, Dr. Spooner, your book on Canada, the Congo, and the UN at the height of the Cold War was written in 2009, towards the end of the Afghanistan War, which was for Canada, which was the largest conflict in which the turn from the image of peacekeeper to active combatant occurred. So, given the 16-year distance from the first publishing of the book, and the new work that you're writing now on this history, would you approach the content of the book differently now? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that it was a challenging book to write in some ways. In other ways, not. I mean, there's a nice chronological beginning and end, 60 to 64, kind of while when we were there. So the chronology provided some nice bookends for the project in terms of beginning and end points. But how to actually tell that story was challenging because at the time, is this going to be an operational history? Am I going to write because one of the odd things historiographically about peacekeeping in Canada is, Canadians have this incredible image of ourselves as peacekeepers. It seems and quite arguably an over amplified image of ourselves as peacekeepers. And yet there's not very much written uh, at the specific operational level, like actual full book length studies of individual peacekeeping missions. And so when I was writing the book originally, how much of this is going to be an operational history of what the peacekeepers were doing on the ground? But I've always, in some ways, been more interested in foreign policy and that aspect of it, right? So how do you balance those two things of trying to do justice to writing a kind of a military history of what the peacekeepers were doing on the ground and in the air, because again, the Air Force played an incredibly important and integral role in supporting ONUC. So how do you do that on the one hand, and on the other side, also deal with the foreign policy side of things? And so I think in some ways, I probably, if I was redoing this again, I might spend even more time, even though we still lack these operational histories of peacekeeping in some ways. It's the foreign policy side of this question, the context, everything you were just talking about, the fact that this is all happening at an incredibly heightened point in the Cold War. And it's such an interesting case study, not just from the military point of view, but from the foreign, what it tells us about our foreign policy and our developing relationship in Africa. And I think so I think I probably would be tempted if I was rewriting this again. I'd be tempted to talk even more about the foreign policy, which might have just meant that the book got longer rather than which you're not supposed to do. But that's probably where that would have went. And I think also the underlying questions around race. And I think race has long been a less studied aspect of our international history in Canada. And I think that it's not to say that it's not been done, but I think it's not been done as much as other aspects of our international history. And so I think teasing out that there is some of that in the book for sure, but I think I probably would have spent even more time, I think, delving into those aspects of the story.
Are there any, just teasing off of that, are there any histories that not necessarily Canadian, but are there any references to those topics with regards to peacekeeping or Cold War politics with regards to, especially with this conflict and the approach to decolonized nations that you would recommend to people if they wanted to learn more about those topics?
About the sort of the racialized aspect or the critical sort of racial approach. Um, Yeah, I mean, there's some very good provocative pieces. Like, yeah, and I think one of the more later, like I'm thinking of Somalia, right? Somalia has generated, of course, generated some really interesting work. Grant Dawson's done some excellent work on the history of peacekeeping in Somalia, but also from a critical race perspective, Shireen Razak's work is also something else that I would recommend to people to look at and to think about because it does try to get at some of those underlying racialized assumptions, right? That are fundamentally underpinning a lot of what was happening in Somalia. Looking back through history, there's less of it, right? And I
Mhm.
think that's it's the more kind of contemporary uh, post-Cold War period where peacekeeping goes terribly wrong. Somalia, Rwanda, arguably, even in the Balkans, Lewis Mackenzie has written very critical things about that peacekeeping operation. So I mean, there tends to be the more critical historiography and historical writing about peacekeeping tends to come in the post-Cold War period. And so, yeah, that's another interesting, I think, vacuum of ways in which we could go back into the history, into those earlier Cold War period. It's partly just because there's such an explosion of peacekeeping in the post-Cold War period. Um, but that's not to say that there aren't underlying tensions. And I mean, in the Congo, if we go back to that and give just one last example, it's not also just uh, the racialized tensions are super complicated. You also have a lot of tensions, for example, between Asian peacekeepers and African peacekeepers on the ground in the Congo. So it's not just the European peacekeepers who sometimes find things challenging. Sometimes the Asian peacekeepers as well. There were often tensions between the Asian peacekeepers and the Congolese population, but even the Asian peacekeepers and other peacekeepers from other other nations. So yeah, there's a lot I think still that could be written about that. Yeah.
So I have a few more questions, but
Yeah.
I do see we have questions trickling in from the audience, so I want to give some space for that. So we have one. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation, Dr. Spooner. Could you please briefly dwell upon the stance of Canada in regard to the situation in Southern Africa in the 1970s and 80s, especially in the period when the UN sanctions on South Africa were imposed as a response to the country's continuing policy of apartheid and its military involvement in Namibia and Angola, aka South Africa border war. It is known that the position of the USA regarding the conflict was rather questionable. It is well described in the book In Search of Enemies, a CIA story by John Stockwell, the former chief of the CIA's Angola task force. What was the position of Canada in the UN and beyond with regards to that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Southern Africa, so I tend to, in my work on Africa, I did the Congo in the 1960s, and then I've worked more directly on during the Cold War on East and West Africa, so Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, Nigeria, those regions within Africa. So Southern Africa is not preface anything I say with that proviso. In terms of apartheid, I mean Canada, that I mean, there's an interesting example of a way in which we were, in some ways, separated, and that alliance, the Western Alliance, is somewhat divided there, right? Canada, particularly during the Mulroney years, particularly under the leadership of Joe Clark, took a very critical look and a very critical approach towards apartheid and South Africa, relative particularly to our Western allies, Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. And in fact, there were incredible tensions within the Commonwealth between the Canadian position and the British position, and the Canadians were often seen to be more sympathetic with African nations on the issue of apartheid. Um, Even more than say our Australian and New Zealand. Like we tended to be the ones that the white senior dominions within the Commonwealth, right, that was actually taking a stand, a more arguably principled stand against apartheid in those associations. So it is an interesting example in some ways. What's going on in Southern Africa in the 70s and 80s is an interesting example of a division within towards the end of the Cold War, right? Of a division within that Western alliance, and Canada really being separated from its both in that case, as we're not even trying to find our way between the United Kingdom and the United States. Both of them are on one side of an issue. Um, less willing to take a hard stand on sanctions against South Africa, for example. And we do peacekeeping, certainly in Namibia, right? I mean, we're present in Angola. We do send peacekeepers to Angola. We send peacekeepers to Namibia. And generally, I think, and that this is maybe another lesson of the Congo. Generally, whenever you're sending peacekeepers abroad, you then try, if you've got people on the ground in a country, you try to at least frame your policies generally in as much an impartial way as you can, right? Because you don't want to compromise or jeopardize the position of people you have on the ground, soldiers, peacekeepers that you might have on the ground, contributing to United Nations peacekeeping mission. That principle of impartiality, right, that I talked about earlier. So, um, but that said, I think in the context of South Africa, and there are others historians, if that person wants to reach out to me, I can give them there's excellent young scholars doing really good work on that particular period of and that particular region of Africa and Canadian policy on it. So I'm happy to share those with the listener later. Yeah.
And then we have Canada has continued to rely on its Cold War peacekeeping legacy, and we've been able to stay at the international table because of it. As the world power dynamics shift, is peacekeeping still a viable role for Canada?
Wow, that's a difficult question to answer. Is it a viable role for Canada? Um, it's interesting because often critics of peacekeeping will say, well, peacekeeping kind of dies off. And if you look at it statistically, no, not really. I mean, the UN does kind of re-engage in peacekeeping, again, once it learns kind of the hard lessons of the Brahimi report. And it's not to say that there aren't still to this day continuing problems with peacekeeping, right? Peacekeeping is the UN continues to have challenges around, sexual violence within peacekeeping and exploitation. I mean, there are certainly challenges and problems that confront peacekeeping today. So it's not to say that everything is rosy and glorious in the field of peacekeeping. The challenge, I think, for Canada and the viability for Canada continues to be, and maybe this will change as the current government is clearly intent and keen to reinvest in the Canadian Armed Forces. So maybe we'll begin to see a shift here. That's an interesting question. But part of the challenge, I think, for the Canadian Armed Forces has always been that they're not that big, right? And so that's if once you commit to something like our current commitment with NATO to Latvia, that requires an enormous percentage. I mean, for every soldier, I mean, I think the Canadian public tend to forget that for every soldier you have in the field, you've got sort of someone who's coming back, sort of on leave from having just been in the field, someone who's preparing to go to the field. So for every one person you've got posted abroad, you've kind of got two other people who are kind of committed from having come back or about to head out. And once you start to do that math and you realize how many deployable forces we have within the Canadian military, you realize pretty quickly there's not a lot. And so we tend to do one thing at a time. So, if I go back to that graph I was showing earlier, there's this big peak of, over 3,000 peacekeepers in the early 1990s at the sort of tail end of the Brian Mulroney conservative government, when we're kind of at our peak. But that huge commitment to peacekeeping at that point really makes it stretches things quite thin within the Canadian military. And of course, then we switch to NATO and sending more troops to the Balkans and then to Afghanistan. And so it seems as though Canada, because of the limited nature of our military, we can do one thing really well at a time, but trying to do multiple things is challenging. And so would we be able to re-engage in that sort of peacekeeping? The and there's another example, right? The Justin Trudeau government, when he first came to power, 2015-ish, right? He was very keen, right? We wanted to re-engage in peacekeeping. There was a summit in Vancouver about peacekeeping. It looked like we were on the cusp of reimagining and re-engaging with the United Nations on peacekeeping, and it never really materialized. Why is that? Well, again, I think it's because the military has a lot of commitments, and it's really, really hard for them to do more than unless we see, and maybe we're on the cusp of that, a fairly significant reinvestment in the military that would make it possible to actually do more than one thing at a time in a really strong, meaningful way. And you also have to have military at home, right? There are issues around having the capacity to protect the homeland. And that's another a piece of that puzzle that makes it, I think, harder for us to imagine a re-engagement with peacekeeping. And also, where do you peacekeep, right? I mean, go back to those racialized concerns, right? Is it appropriate for Canada to be peacekeeping? And maybe the more appropriate place to do it is to do what we did in the Cold War so well, which is you provide all of the support, whether it's aerial support or signal support or all of the logistics that need to happen to keep peacekeepers in the field. Maybe that's a place where you focus your energies. Yeah.
That makes me think of a CTV article that I was reading this morning that was talking about the chief of the defense staff was looking to have 300,000 citizen soldiers or auxiliaries set up at home to be able to free up for those enlistments towards, both the reserve and the primary force of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I thought that was just really interesting, echoing back to the Cold War civil defense idea
Mhm.
and the idea of defending the country from that perspective. So the last question from the audience, Flips, and then I have one more just before we
Mhm.
finish off. What were the characteristics of a successful peacekeeping mission that Canada was involved in? And then conversely, what are the characteristics of a conflict which are setting up a peacekeeping mission for failure?
Yeah, that's that. And I keep with the audience has a lot of really good questions tonight. And the Congo is an interesting case study in this way because it's some people look back at the Congo and they and ONUG and they see this as an example of a peacekeeping mission that failed terribly because ultimately, of course, Mobutu Sese Seko comes to power. It becomes this horrific dictatorship of, kleptocracy for the next, how many decades before until he's deposed from power. But, I've always questioned that, right? Like, how do you, it's a really interesting question. How do you decide whether a peacekeeping mission's been successful or not? And I've always kind of made the argument that ONU was relatively successful. It kind of achieved the limited objectives that it was given, which was to try to ultimately preserve the sort of territorial integrity of the Congo, which it does, right? I didn't even talk about the fact that there was a whole secession crisis during this process and how that complicated what was going on in terms of peacekeeping in the Congo. Um, does it restore law and order in the Congo? Yes, sort of in the time and the time that it's there. Again, the secession is finally put to an end while the peacekeepers are there, and perhaps they played a less impartial role than they were supposed to in terms of bringing that secession to an end. So that's another question. But so I think having a clear set of objectives, right? What is it that the mission is supposed to accomplish? And how clear cut the peacekeeping mission can be to keeping to those expectations, right? So that's one piece, right? What's the mandate and how realistic is the mandate going in? That's one piece of the puzzle. So are you setting up a mission for failure from the outset because you've given it a mandate that's too ambitious and there's no way that it can achieve it? Secondly, I mean, do you have the resources and do you have the political will to actually make this happen? Right. Uh, and why does Rwanda fail? Well, arguably, there's lots of reasons why that peacekeeping mission doesn't stop a genocide, but in part it's political will, right? I mean, there's an unwillingness and the UN is only as capable as its member states. And if the member states are not willing to put the resources into the United Nations as a vehicle for peacekeeping that need to be there, they don't have the political will to actually intervene, then that also can be undermining for a peacekeeping mission. So I think you have to have, a clear mandate. You have to have the political will and the resources backing the deployment from the UN. I think that one of the lessons that the UN learned as well was, you need to have a certain degree of infrastructure within the United Nations. And this is kind of the remarkable thing about the Congo. When you look back in 1960, and the UN in some ways accomplished a crazy thing, right? They had at one point 20,000 peacekeepers in the field, and they got a huge number of peacekeepers into the field incredibly quickly without any virtually no peacekeeping infrastructure in New York. There's no central authority. They've got a few bureaucrats in the secretariat who are trying to run this thing, right? And so it's remarkable in some ways what they managed to accomplish, largely by relying on countries to step up and do the logistical work that needed to happen to make that accomplished. So I think the other lesson that was learned to try to make peacekeeping more successful was the fact that the UN does, particularly in the post-Cold War period, when these missions become incredibly complex, in some ways begin to mirror what ONUC looked like during the Cold War. You're often Cambodia is a great example, right? You're sending tens of thousands of personnel. You're not just peacekeeping, you're state building, you're providing technical assistance to a government. Um, so I think that's the other piece. You have to have good institutional systems in place uh, at the UN itself, or with other, whether it's the African Union or other international organizations that are providing peacekeeping support. I think you need to have the necessary infrastructure in place to make and the systems in place to make that work. And Lewis Mackenzie and Romeo Dallaire will often talk about, they calling into New York trying to find someone to answer the phone on the weekend, right? Because, you know, literally there's no one there to answer the phone, no one to deal with things on the other end. So in some ways the question is answered by, the same things that set a peacekeeping mission up for failure are, if you address those ahead of time, are the things that help to make sure that they're successful, right, in the end. Yeah, I'm not sure I fully answered that question, but
So jumping back just to tie things up a little bit, what lessons do you want folks in the audience to learn from this mission, with regards to peacekeeping, but then generally with the Cold War in general? But then also, if people pick up your book and read it, what lessons do you want them to learn from what you've written?
Uh, that our peacekeeping history is complicated. It's not simple. Um, I think we imagine it to be simple. In some ways, we want it to be simple. We love that just sort of image of ourselves, and I think um, it is much more complex than that. And I think fundamentally, I go back to a point that you raised, Sean, at the very beginning, right? That it's also about recognizing that peacekeeping was not necessarily driven by altruism. Right? And there's this perception, I think, that peacekeeping is this great altruistic thing that we do. We do peacekeeping for lots of pragmatic, practical reasons. There's one great metaphor of thinking about during the Cold War, especially. You think of peacekeeping as being sort of fire insurance and NATO as life insurance, right? You want NATO and NORAD as life insurance because you need a bunker to hide in when the nuclear bombs start falling on the one side, but you want fire insurance, which is putting out these bushfires around the world that were these proxy conflicts during the Cold War. So there are very practical reasons why, the Canadian government engaged in peacekeeping throughout the Cold War. And it wasn't, we weren't being driven by this sort of angelic vision of ourselves as peacekeepers, needing to save the world from itself, right? No, I mean there were practical reasons why Canadian governments engaged in this. So that's the one thing. And I think the other point is something that you also raised. Diefenbaker's perception, the perception that we have of the Diefenbaker government is that he was just a colossal screw up when it came to foreign policy, right? That he couldn't make decisions, that he was incapable of, and sometimes this is used, the Congo was used as an example of that, right? That he flip-flopped. First he said, he's jumping out of his chair and he's saying, "There's no way we're not going peacekeeping. I'm not sending French-speaking Canadians to the Congo." Um, and then he makes the decision to go. And as a historian, you spend hours in the archives, days, weeks, months, looking for the smoking gun document. Why did he flip-flop, right? And it took me months to realize there's no flip-flop, right? He's not indecisive. He's dealing with a picture of what's going on that's changing by the hour, by the day. As I'm reading documents, I'm having to like mark things now, not just by the day they arrived, but what hour they arrived to understand, okay, what did he think was going on now versus 6 hours later when something is different, right? Because the communication from New York to Ottawa is changing so quickly because the situation on the ground in the Congo is changing so quickly. And the situation between New York and all the other capitals around the world is changing so quickly. And so as I delved into the documents, as you start to do the research, you realize there is no flip-flop. It's just as the situation clarified and as they realized that there's no way Hammarskjöld was ever going to ask Canada to send infantry troops. He knew from the outset that that was a non-starter. Uh, but he also knew that he was going to need some sort of highly skilled technical support, logistics, communications, air support. And that he knew Canada would be capable of providing. But there's this kind of mismatch in communication. So I think the other big lesson I hope people take away from the book is that this is not an example of Diefenbaker flip-flopping. This is an example. I wouldn't want to read too much into that. I mean, Diefenbaker can still flip-flop on other things, but this is not one place where he flip-flopped. This is a place where he made a decision that evolved over time as the picture became more clear. So I would hope that that's something else that maybe people take away from it. And I hope a new generation of historians, as I'm starting to do now, really look at the underlying issues of race, right? And the way that those are incredibly important. It's not just this East-West. There's a whole North-South element to the Cold War that I think has been undervalued and underwritten. And I think we need to do a lot more work in that. So I hope maybe the book inspires some people to take on that challenge too.
All right, so that's all the questions we have. I want to thank Dr. Kevin Spooner, Professor of North American Studies and History at Wilfrid Laurier University and Director of the Laurier Centre for the Study of Canada. Dr. Spooner, where can people go to follow you and your work?
The best place to go is the center itself. So studyofcanada.ca. We can maybe put the link up in the chat, but that's the center is where I spend most of my days and most of my time, and so that's the place to go to find out what we're up to.
All right, excellent. Thank you again, Dr. Spooner. I highly recommend following up and reading Dr. Spooner's book, Canada, the Congo Crisis and UN Peacekeeping, 1960-64, amongst many other chapters that you've contributed to regarding the topic and foreign policy, to learn more about the intricacies of Canadian foreign policy during the Cold War and how it tried to influence responses to crises in decolonized countries. That concludes the event for this evening and for the series this season. I want to thank you all for attending this evening's talk, as well as our previous sessions to learn a little bit more about the Cold War and how its past is still with us today. We look forward to seeing you at next year's series of events. Thank you and take care.